So Esther's story starts off like this. Bad news. She was born into slavery in a foreign land. Good news. Her family is together. Bad news. Both of her parents die, leaving her an orphan. Good news. She gets to have her kind cousin, Mordecai, raise her. Bad news. The selfish king is scooping up all the beautiful girls for a royal beauty pageant. Bad news. If she doesn't satisfy the king, she still has to stay in his harem for the rest of her life. She'll probably never be married and have a life of her own. Good news. She's the winner. She pleased the king more than anyone else. Bad news. Haman, a newly promoted leader in the king's court, is angry at Esther's cousin, Mordecai, for not bowing down to him. He gets permission to have all the Jews, Esther's people, killed. I could go on like this through the rest of the book, but I think you get the picture. It's a bad news, good news kind of life. Have you ever felt like that? You're just going along fine, life is grand, and suddenly you find yourself in a crisis you never asked for. And this crisis forces you to face your deepest fears. Maybe you found out someone you love is dying or has a life-threatening illness. Maybe you were in a serious car accident and are facing months of recovery. Maybe you slipped on the ice or slipped at work and have injured your back, your hip, something else that is hurting. Maybe you have to resist carrying out unethical practices at work. Maybe you're being tempted at school to cheat or to look on someone's paper and you're not sure what it is you should do. So how do you find the courage at times like that? Courage is the strength to take risk, to face danger, to endure difficulty, to withstand fear. Courage, you see, is not the absence of fear. Rather, it withstands fear. You need the fear in order to call it courage, as the strongest source of courage for us in the face of fear is our faith. The faith that God gives to us. When you place your faith in God, you find courage to face the threats, the problems that are bigger than you can handle. Because now you have tapped into the only power that can overcome them. Esther did exactly that in her journey of faith. There are 3 things that we can learn from Esther's story. First is in the crisis, find your calling. In the crisis, whatever it may be, find your calling. Esther feels the circumstances closing in around her. She's trying to avoid it affecting her directly, but she can't because this threat is about her people, her family, her people. We see in Esther's story the guiding hand of God in bringing Esther to a strategic position in the king's court. But all Esther can see is that she's in big trouble, and her family too. Mordecai reminds her that whether she admits to it or not, her identity as a Jewish person would get her killed. And so his words ring. Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Perhaps God has placed you in a particular place and point in your life for just such a time as this. So in the crisis, find your calling. My mother was dying, and over the course of 4 months, we journeyed with her. You've heard me speak of that. And as the time progressed and she got closer and closer to death, she struggled greatly, much, much pain. And she wondered, why am I still here? Why won't God end this now? It just didn't make sense. And so as we spoke about that, I wondered with her and asked her to ponder, maybe you are here to show us, my sister and I and her grandchildren, our daughters, our families, her friends, maybe, just maybe, you are still here to show us what it is to die well. To die well, grounded in faith and love of God. My mother pondered that and could see that in her prolonged dying, that she had opportunities to tell her story of faith, a lifelong faith. She had the gift to sit with her granddaughters, with my sister and I, with our families, to say, this is how God has led me through life, and this is how God is with you and will lead you through life. Perhaps she had come to this place for just such a time as this. So in your crisis, find your calling. Figure out what it is that God is placing in your lap. What opportunity is there in the midst of things we don't understand and in the midst of the struggles we can't seem to make sense out of? How is it that God is calling you to be Christ in that time? The second thing we learned from Esther is to use your fear to find your faith. Use your fear to find your faith. Esther finally realizes her unique call. If she goes in to see the king, she may perish. If she does not go in, she will certainly perish, because Haman has placed a death sentence on all of the Jews. Nothing like an ultimatum to clear things up. Now, notice that in verse 15 of our reading there in Esther chapter 4, Esther tells Mordecai to gather all the Jews in the city and to fast for 3 days. She then promises that she and her maids will do the same. In the Jewish tradition, fasting is associated with prayer. It's the outward spiritual discipline of waiting on the Lord, of seeking the Lord's guidance and strength. Now think about what Esther must have been going through. She's so desperate for God to intervene that she will go without food so that she can wait for the Lord to act and to lead her. If Esther had heard about the royal decree to kill the Jews and said, "No problem, I'll just pop in and talk to the king right away," we wouldn't have called her courageous. We would have called her foolish and reckless. Because you see, going before the king uninvited is punishable by death. So Esther's legitimate fear caused her to put on the brakes, to approach with caution. In her fear, she connected with God, found her faith. Where did Esther get her courage? Was she born that way? Is it just that some people have more courage than others? No. Courage is choosing to be guided by faith in God in spite of feeling fearful. There's a great title to a series of books that I enjoy that say, "Feel the fear," feel it, F-E-E-L, feel the fear and do it anyway. Let the faith in God, our trust in God's presence with us, lead us through the times when we are fearful. Turn to God, wait for the Lord, and let him guide you. So 2 things we've learned from Esther. First, in the crisis, find your calling. Second, use your fear to find your faith. And third now, lose yourself to find courage. Lose yourself to find courage. Esther shifted from self-preservation to concern for her people. Once Esther got her eyes off of herself and thought about the greater good, the preservation of the Jews, her family, she found the courage for speaking boldly to the king. When she was worried about her personal safety, she was hesitant and fearful. But once her perspective changed, she rose to the occasion. She found the courage to put her own safety on the line, to make a courageous decision, to establish a bold plan and carry it out. Many years ago, while working at a local psychiatric hospital with adolescents who were committed there for treatment, I was there as their teacher, would help them keep up with their assignments and prepare them to return to school. I spent a lot of time with the patients there, more than anyone else, it seemed, on that unit, for I would have them for 4 hours straight each day to do our schoolwork. And so our time together, we developed a trusting relationship with one another. A young man who had been admitted and was later discharged to a foster home continued to struggle with living outside of the hospital. He found my phone number and called me at home one night. He told me that he knew it was probably not a good idea to call me, but that he just had to reach out to someone, and I was that person. He told me that he was holding a gun in his lap, that it was loaded, and that he was going to take his life because of his fear. He knew that he had broken the parameters of his release from the hospital, and so he was afraid that he would be sent back to that place. And he was afraid. And so he was planning a very desperate measure, and he wanted someone to know about it. I asked him if his foster parents were at home, and he said yes, they were asleep. And I said, well, then I need you to go and wake them up. And he said, I don't want to do that. I know you don't, but that's what you need to do. You called me, and this is what I'm telling you to do. And so he said that he would. And I said, I'm going to wait right here on the phone until I speak with one of them. So he went off for a bit. He came back, and this time his foster mom answered the phone with him. And I said, I want to make sure that he's safe tonight. And then I recommend that you bring him back to the hospital tomorrow. She agreed to do that. The next morning, as I went into the hospital and went to pull his chart so that I can make a note that I had spoken with him overnight and what was happening, I was met in the hallway of the adolescent unit, and I was summoned to speak to the HR department. For you see, the mom called the psychiatrist, told the psychiatrist that he had reached out to his former teacher, and that was against the rules. And so they determined that I had broken a rule and decided that my employment needed to end. It's a call that I would have made had that happened again in the middle of the night. I would not have turned this young man away and said, I can't talk to you, goodbye. I would not have ever done that. Yes, I knew the risk. I knew that it was an employment breach of possibility, but my concern and care for this young man was paramount that night. He needed me, and I was going to be there for him. I was escorted off the property of the hospital that day and told never to step foot on that property again. Some years later, this young man reached out to me once more, and he said to me, I have carried the shame and guilt of you being fired from the hospital, and I just want to apologize. And I said, there are no apologies needed, for you are alive today by the grace of God. It was a few years after that Bob and I received the invitation to his wedding. He attended my installation here at St. Philip Lutheran Church, and I'm going to have lunch with him tomorrow. You see, this young man is alive by the grace of God and by his courage to pick up a phone and to call for help. So what about you? What crisis are you facing? Is God calling you to a new cause, a new task, a new way of being in the world? How is it that God is reaching out to you in the midst of circumstances and situations that you might not understand? What fears are you feeling? Is God inviting you to put your faith, your trust in him, to fall back into his arms of mercy, knowing that we don't know the end of the story in our everyday lives, but we know the end of the story for all eternity, and that with God, all things are possible as God works in and among us as God's people. In what ways do you need to lose yourself so that you can live more fully in the abundant life that God desires for you? Is God prompting you to die to self and to find courage? My sisters and brothers, from Esther, we see the benefit of faith. Not an intellectual faith up here that says, oh yes, I know, I believe, but rather a living faith that actually shapes how we live in the world. Luther's definition of faith is one that rattles around in my head most of the time, and it is this: faith is a living, bold trust in God's grace, so certain of God's favor that it would risk death 1,000 times trusting in it. Such confidence and knowledge of God's grace that makes you happy, joyful, and bold in your relationship to God and all creatures. Because of faith, Luther says, you freely, willingly, and joyfully do good to everyone, serve everyone, suffer all kinds of things, love and praise the God who has shown you such grace. We do not walk through our lives alone. God is with us, and by God's power, we are equipped with the courage, the faith that's needed to move through today and tomorrow and all the tomorrows to come. Amen.